We have gathered here before you today some of the organizations who have been working on issues regarding the financial complexity, tax issues, transparency issues that we have been discussing for 2 days really. So I have some questions to the organizations and I hope you can help me figure out this because I do not have the answer and we're all struggling with this. But first of all, before we start, could I ask you just to introduce yourself, just to say your name and why this issue is important for your organization and with your goal? Very, very briefly. We can start with you, Johan.
Yes, so hello everybody. My name is Johan Hermstad. I'm the director of the Norwegian Council for Africa, and we're a human rights and solidarity movement, heading back from the time of fighting against colonial structures and apartheid racist structures that undermine human rights and deny human rights. So we're coming at this from a very sort of structuralist perspective regarding the African continent. And to us, it's one of the most important things that we sort of assess is whether or not Norwegian commercial actors on the continent act in a way that support human rights. And of course, in that regard, anti-corruption and financial secrecy is key. So specifically, I think I'll try to sort of stick to one example while discussing this this afternoon, and that's basically our attention towards payments to governments in Angola, and specifically the case of Statoil in Angola, which we had a campaign on in 2015 and 16. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Sven Larsen. I'm with the Norwegian Church Aid, based in Oslo. Why is the NCA, Norwegian Church Aid, involved in this topic? Well, it's a big problem. That's number one. It's a big problem, and it's an area where we can actually make a change. So that's the second part. The problem is big, but we can actually make a difference, and I think that's part of the basic analysis why we entered into working on this topic, short form.
Hi, my name is Peter Ringstad. I'm with Tax Justice Network Norway. It's sort of within the name itself that we are engaged in this issue, although tax justice isn't really a concept that a lot of people easily understand. So many people find it very unfair to pay taxes at all. But tax justice for us is can, I think, most easily be understood as if you take the fight against tax havens. So you have on one side the financial secrecy in the tax havens, which enables all sorts of wrongdoing in terms of corruption, insider trading, all sort of shenanigans in business, and all these sort of aspects that really harm and undermine society. And then you have the tax aspect. You have the global race to the bottom in taxes, which also tax havens represent, where you really have sort of the more societal distributional issues, the economic inequality. So I think both those concepts is something that we work on as a part of the tax justice movement. And so this goes very much to the core of what we try to do.
Good afternoon. My name is Skaaren Fystro. I come from Transparency International Norway. And Transparency International is concerned with these issues because it's closely related to corruption, or actually when it comes to tax havens and that sort of things, it's facilitating corrupt transactions. And why are we so concerned with that? That's because we believe very strongly that corruption is very detrimental to economic and social development, to justice. And I think from that context, I agree also with what Professor Kallemoen said earlier on today, where he pointed out that okay, it's corruption in itself and tax havens in itself, but it's also, something which is actually make the problems, the structural problems, even more problematic. So it's related to that. I mean, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, and it's wrong. It destroys the basic rights of hundreds of millions of people across the world. It has devastating consequences on the services provided by public institutions, and it undermines the prospects for a better life for future generations. TI Norway is primarily addressing corruption in Norway, and it has been difficult in the sense that I think we had very sort of hard-bent illusions about, this is not something that is related to Norwegian companies or Norwegian institutions. This is related to other countries that we are not comparing ourselves with. But thanks to good investigative journalism, I think that that has changed quite a lot. I think there's been a new awareness about these things that we are addressing. So I think that is our motivation, and also for working and to associating ourselves with the work that's been presented here today.
We've been talking what the experts do, the researchers, the law, accounting, financial engineering. We've been talking about investigative journalism, what we can do, what is hard to do. What do organizations do on this topic? What is possible to do for an organization? Could you help us share a little bit, and perhaps you're able to give an example of what your organization has done to tackle this issue, and perhaps also why you chose to do exactly that. Johan, please.
Yes. So I mean, so as I sort of suggested just now earlier, I mean, I would like to sort of tell you about an example, which is the example of Statoil in Angola, which I'm sure that several of you are a bit familiar with through the public eye, and we've been heavily engaged with that through quite some years. Not solely us, of course, also other actors, but sort of how we engage with these issues is basically we sort of try to put it down to its core, and engage get these problems into the public eye. Now, sort of the core of the issue here in this campaign was was twofold. On the one side, you have Norwegian commercial entities that are engaged with local entities, local companies that have undisclosed owners. So that's kind of the one part, and the second problem that we sort of addressed was quite huge flows of money that went to went into black holes, or whatever you want to call it, like social bonuses, bonuses for development of what now is a quite famous research center that never existed, for instance, and kind of what we, if I may sort of, actually, I'm gonna try to show you a video, and then I'd like to sort of say just a couple of words about some of the problems that we encountered in developing this campaign. So I really hope there's sound now.
Til sjøs, men også på land. Vi få her oppe I det værbitte nord. Likevel snakkes det om den norske modellen over hele kloden. Det vi finner I havet vårt, kommer oss alle til gode. Og nå har vi reist ut I verden. Med lua I hånda og verdiene våre I lomma gjør vi det vi best på, slik at andres eventyr skal få en like lykkelig start som vårt eget. At olje fører til velferd har vi nordmenn erfart, og nå det Angola sin tur. Norsk næringsliv til stede, og vi samarbeider med angolanske selskaper, slik at de kan vokse og bidra til landets økonomi. Da får Angola mulighet til å bygge opp et godt helsesystem med... Nei, ja, her skulle det vært bilde av et sykehus. Men altså andre velferdsgoder som skole, filler heller altså. Oljepengene skulle jo ha gått til utdanningssystemet. Vi vet ikke alltid hvem som tjener penger på de prosjektene vi er med på, og det er en del korrupsjon i Angola. Men altså, vi nordmenn gjør så godt vi kan. Vi har verdiene våre med oss, og så håper vi det går bra. Det er det viktigste. Den økonomiske veksten i Angola kommer ikke befolkningen til gode. Angola er verdens 15. mest korrupte land. Norsk næringsliv samarbeider med angolanske selskaper som har skjulte eiere. Og derfor kan hverken vi eller det angolanske folket finne ut hvor pengene blir av.
Can I perhaps ask what was the result of this campaign? What challenges did you meet when you tried to raise awareness and debate about this topic?
So I mean, to start out with the results, I mean, the result with regards to beneficial ownership, Statoil has retracted or sold their shares in projects in Angola where there are undisclosed owners, based purely on commercial sort of considerations, of course. And I mean, there was a great deal of attention towards the bonuses, the social bonuses that were paid. However, there's yet no sort of that case largely remains unresolved. But there are quite a few challenges, both in this campaign and sort of in its circumstances. I mean, what we really face here is, I mean, we're talking about communicating complex financial realities into sort of into society, and what you also see in this film and in the entire campaign is a great simplification of political structures, right? I mean, we are in a constant risk as an NGO of sort of oversimplifying financial structures and oversimplifying political structures in a way that could, for instance, contribute to creating that single story. The one single story about the African continent that we, in our other work, strive towards sort of killing, telling. So it's kind of a it's pretty huge dilemma to us as an organization who works for a nuanced perspective on the African continent with its enormous varieties, while at the same time sort of trying to drive political change in an environment, a media environment, where the simple message is the only way of getting attention.
Thank you for that last question, because the last sentence, because that actually leads me to the next question. I would like to finalize with one question, and I will ask the same questions to all of you. It just came very natural. Which concrete experiences do you have when contacting journalists with this information or with complex information? What are your experiences?
Well, I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, I mean, there's a reason why the campaign was on Angola and not on Nigeria, for instance. Not necessarily because the challenges with the financial secrecy and undisclosure of beneficial ownership is any less of a problem in Nigeria, but it's easier in an Angolan context to paint sort of a simplistic picture. So if I speak to a journalist about financial integrity and secrecy in Nigeria, and it's links to the political system, it becomes boring to a certain extent. While the story about the long-serving president in Angola for 35 years with a daughter who's the richest woman in Africa. Like you get a lot of killer facts that is sort of the only way to getting attention from a Norwegian journalist's perspective, and that's kind of that's a real dilemma that we struggle with, sort of this tension between sort of, well, on the one hand, you know, all we do is try to sort of work our way into nuancing the simplistic pictures of Africa, like I said, while we sort of, in the struggle for attention, create those same types of mechanisms. Yeah.
Which choices does Norwegian Church Aid do? Do you have any examples on activities your organization have been doing in order to raise awareness?
Yes, I do. Thanks for asking. So I have 2 examples. Both of them are from last week. It was a busy week. First, what happened in Norway? Something that happened in Norway last week. I wanted to show you. Let me see. All right. First, let's do Norway. So, of course, what the NCA, Norwegian Church Aid, does in Norway is fairly small scale compared to what we do out there in the world. Seeing as we're a development NGO, most of our work goes on out there somewhere. This is a picture from last week where you can see Helge André Njåstad. He's the second leader, andre nestleder I Finanskomiteen. The leader of the Finance Committee has now become the Minister of Development in Norway. So we asked him if he could meet us and receive our petition signatures. We have been collecting petitions in Norway to reform the tax system because it's outdated. Now you see a very old car. It's from the 1930s, and so are the principles of our tax system, our international tax system. They are from the 1930s. So this is one way we tried to get through the head of politicians who are busy with so many topics, to give him one thing, that the international principles of the tax system was developed a long time ago, before internet, before computers. It's still the same. The basis is still the same. The world is completely different. So this is one way we are trying to do something. We are trying to create political will and understanding about what is about the topic. So we're just trying to get through. Okay, so that was something from Norway, and then something from Cape Town. I just came from Cape Town this weekend. I didn't flush once. Hold on. Okay, we have from the mining in Daba. Some of you have perhaps from South Africa heard about the mining in Daba. The mining in Daba is a meeting with businesses and politicians talking about how do we, Indaba means conference in Zulu. So it's basically bringing, or the main conference is about bringing business together with politicians and see how can we do mining in Africa. So we've developed a alternative platform to discuss, to bring and empower local communities to come to that arena and discuss with those people. And I think that's been a success. 9 years ago, that was a small seminar with 40 people in a room. Now it's a conference of 600 people to the alternative conference, which we are facilitating with NGOs. And for us, it's really important to bring in faith leaders. So we bring bishops, we bring sheikhs, we bring those people who actually know who is suffering on the ground because of lack of tax justice, lack of transparency. So, in short, I don't know if that made sense, but that's what we're doing to try at least, to involve in the topic and create change.
Thank you also for saying something about the results of the activities that you're doing. But Could you share a little bit also on what concrete experiences you have when contacting journalists with this type of information?
Yes, so actually, also last week, there was a podcast, Aftenpodden, with Aftenposten is the biggest Norwegian newspaper. They do the Panama Papers. They did the Panama Papers in Norway, and actually their political editor-in-chief, she's part of this podcast talking about politics in Norway. And then I think this is, it's just a small thing, but it's kind of descriptive. And in that podcast, they were talking about different political issues, and then they've actually they saw the campaign in the streets outside the parliament, and they made reference to it because it's of course a big problem for the media that their, you know, market is kind of being hollowed out by Facebook and Google. Now the newspapers actually producing content, they're losing their income. So they found it curious that someone had a different perspective on the same thing, that poor countries are losing the most, or at least it's more important what they are losing. But then she said she saw the campaign, but then she kind of dismissed the whole thing and said, they're just corrupt in any case. So tax justice doesn't matter because it's all just corrupt. And then Johan actually tweeted to her saying, this is, you know, you can't talk that way. It's a total ridiculous. And now this week they're apologizing, it seems, in the podcast. I'm sorry for telling this is his story. Giving credit to Fellesrådet. So I think, but that's a serious difficulty because people have this, and journalists too, unfortunately, not those in this room, of course, but many, they have this preconception that, you know, it doesn't matter, it's not relevant, and it's news, it's not really newsworthy until you get a big leak, of course, like the Panama Papers or something like that.
May I ask you, Petter, we have 10 more minutes. Could you please give an example on an activity that your organization has done in order to try to raise awareness and increase transparency?
Sure. So one of the main outputs, if I'm going to use that word, of the Tax Justice Network is something called the Financial Secrecy Index. And it's really a response to a couple of things. First, it's a response to so whenever politicians sort of get engaged with this issue, it's usually, okay, so tax havens, who are they? What's the list? And it becomes this black and white sort of issue. And a lot of times these international institutions, such as the OECD, has tried to, okay, so we need to narrow it down to like a list of 40 countries, and these are the black havens, blacklisted tax havens. And this is usually a political outcome. So it's like whoever is not us, first of all, and are not one of our like main strategic allies or trading partners. So you end up with a list of like completely like small countries who have no friends. And that's the blacklist of tax havens. So with the Financial Secrecy Index, we try to, it's actually a huge research project. We publish every 2 years. We try to break down what is financial secrecy into 20 indicators that we measure, and it's actually an EU research team that is peer reviewing the methodology. So it's the only sort of neutral assessment of financial secrecy in the world. And we recently launched the 2018 edition. So you can go in here and you can look at, so what we measure is the amount of financial secrecy in each jurisdiction, and then we scale that with how large is the export of financial services of this jurisdiction. So you end up with a ranking that puts Switzerland as #1 in the world because they have a huge amount of transactions. But you can also look at just the secrecy score, which is just the ranking of the legal system. And so if you go into this, you can look at, let's see if we get this to work. You can look at how it scores on 20 different indicators, and if you go into the Financial Secrecy Index webpage, you can get country reports on each of the 100 and something countries that we put in the index. So this, I hope, can be a useful tool also for journalists and researchers. And then secondly, we do a lot. So 10 years ago, very little academic interest was in this field, and it's because it's really in between a lot of areas. And for economists, it's a problem because this is secret stuff, and economists like to measure things, and they can't really publish any in any good journals if they don't have like proper data to back it up. So we do a lot to help students get involved with writing about these issues, and we actually give guidance to around 30 master students each year, which has been going on for several years, and we now feel that we're sort of contributing to building up a strong academic interest in Norway around these issues and finding new methodologies and sort of figuring out how we talk about this also in an academic way.
One last question to you before Gro will take over. Just very briefly, which concrete experience do you have when you contact journalists with this type of information? Well,
actually we find that we get contacted by journalists more than we contact them, and for us the ICIJ sort of the cooperation of the ICIJ was a game changer in Norway, because then you had like a team working on in depth on these matters for a long time. They needed help to analyze contracts, and they needed sort of to understand it, and once you have that sort of knowledge within a major newspaper, it's so much easier for them now to make new cases and to bring stories out. So I think that was really a game changer, and credit to, we had one newspaper, Aftenposten, who was involved with that, and that has changed a lot. I do have a sort of a challenge for investigative journalists, and I see that it's very productive, this international cooperation, and it's also possible because you're not competing in the same news market, but it's really a need for also national networks of investigative journalism, and I don't really see that happening, and I see so much like sort of at the regional and local policy political level this need to the same sort of backing up by a network, but yeah, I'll leave that to you guys to figure that out.
Could you give an example on what Transparency International in Norway have been doing on with regards to activities to raise awareness?
Okay, so I think everything we do actually has to do with trying to promote transparency, and we work on different levels, different sectors. I think one important work, which is maybe not so visible, is that we are also working with regulators. We are trying to, promote pieces of legislation that has to do with transparency, be it, has in the past been country-by-country reporting, register for beneficial ownership, a lobby register at the parliament, just to mention a few. I think these are very important pieces of legislation that we need to put in place, which is related to the issues we are talking about today. I mean, Norway is a relatively well-regulated country. It's an open society, but still, there are bits and pieces that we need to put in place. We are also working very directly with corporations, with companies, trying to promote transparency, and we are specifically asking them to, or encouraging them to, establish good anti-corruption programs, to be transparent about their beneficial owners, and these country-by-country reports, because we think these are essential elements. I mean, it's not the only elements, but it's essential elements for promoting transparency. And since Peter mentioned this secrecy index, let me just also say that, to the extent that you've heard about Transparency International, we produce every year this Corruption Perception Index. The next one is coming next week on the 21st of February, but since it's embargoed until then, I cannot say much about it. But normally it gets quite a lot of attention, also by journalists. And let me also then ask you to, when you report on it, look at not just the list of the countries that are up among the first the 10 best ones, but look at the whole picture and some of these dramatic things that it actually shows. Yes, it has its methodological limitations and so on. Someone has to use it with a pinch of salt, but it gives an indication. It's a snapshot and takes the temperature of some of the problems that we are struggling with globally and nationally, actually.
You also answered a little bit of the question with regards to journalism. Transparency is perhaps a big organization, so journalists also tend to check this corruption perception index a little bit more. Perhaps we could also give this as our last challenge to journalists, that please contact also organizations. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge and networks within organizations, which perhaps can be very useful for developing any cases. I do not know what more to say now than thank you for being with us. Perhaps would you like to say some words? We will have a similar conference like this next year, but until then, we'll just say thank you for being a part of this conference and sticking with us to the end. So, and thank you also to the panel, to Johan, Sven, Peter, and to Gro. Thank you. Please give the panel a round of applause.